Okay, so we left off talking about changes in short-run aggregate supply. Now we're moving into the equilibrium, and as you can see here, it says it's short-run equilibrium. Now let me refer you over here. It says short-run aggregate supply here, and it says aggregate demand here. I ask you the question, why does it not say short-run aggregate demand? It doesn't say short-run aggregate demand because aggregate demand is not a function of the short run or the long run. It just is. The only thing that's going to fall into discussion here with short run and long run is the aggregate supply curve. And therefore, when you see short run equilibrium, you can think of the equilibrium between aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve. So at P1, the quantity supplied of real GDP is greater than the quantity demanded. As a result, the price level would tend to fall down towards the equilibrium point. This is just like what we saw in chapter 3. And at P2, if you're down here, the quantity demanded of real GDP is greater than the quantity supplied. As a result, the price level would rise. But at the equilibrium, there's no need to move away. And that's why it's called an equilibrium. It's just like what we saw in chapter 3. It's just using different terminology. So how could we change the short run equilibrium in the economy? Well, let's just say that there was an increase in aggregate demand like this chart is showing. What would happen? Well, what would happen was we would see an increase in the price level and we would see an increase in real GDP. If short run aggregate supply increased, which means moved to the right, we would see a decrease in the price level and an increase in real GDP. And if short-run aggregate supply decreased, which means movement to the left, there would be an increase in the price level and a decrease in real GDP. So this chart is a good summation of a lot of things that we just discussed as far as changes in aggregate supply or aggregate demand. You can take a look at that. Okay. This chart summarizes most of what we've discussed in this chapter. So this is a really good tool to kind of just look at prior to the quiz for this chapter. It's really discussing, what's changing aggregate demand. Here's our equation. Here's some of the things that could change individual aspects of it. And over here we have what could change the short run aggregate supply. Certain things that would change that. Something like technology would increase. If technology increased, short-run aggregate supply would increase. That sort of thing. Okay, so last class, you may recall, we talked about this concept of natural unemployment. I don't know if you remember it, but basically what natural unemployment was this situation in which we said zero unemployment is impossible. And we said, actually, you want to have a little bit of unemployment. You want to have the unemployment caused by frictional and structural factors in the economy. In other words, we used the number of about 4%. That's okay to have 4% unemployment. You don't want to go too low with your unemployment. You want to be realistic. So with that natural unemployment, if we could get to a point where our real GDP is producing at that natural unemployment, that's a concept known as natural real GDP. The real GDP that is produced at the natural rate. The real GDP that is produced when the economy is in the long run equilibrium is natural real GDP. To put it in another term that may be more helpful in describing it, I've heard it used as potential GDP, meaning that's the best we could do. If you think about it that way, if our growth potential real GDP, I would think is the same as natural real GDP. They're interchangeable. Okay, so the natural real GDP is the GDP that's produced when the economy is in the long run equilibrium. So long run is further out. Long run. And the long run equilibrium, or the long run aggregate supply curve, I should say, is going to be an upward sloping curve like this. It's a vertical line at the level of natural real GDP. Or, in other words, it's a vertical line at the potential GDP, what you could possibly get if everything was going great. It represents the output the economy produces when all economy-wide adjustments have taken place and workers do not have any relevant misperceptions. It's a vertical line at the level of natural real GDP. And once again, it represents the output the economy produces when all economy-wide adjustments have taken place and workers don't have any relevant misperceptions. So what do the states of the economy look like? This one, I'd ask you, where is our economy in this chart? And the economy is here at point 1, but it wants to be here at the long run equilibrium. So this short run equilibrium is here, but the long run equilibrium is where aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply curve intersect. During the time an economy moves from one equilibrium to another, it is said to be in disequilibrium. So the long run equilibrium is the condition that exists in the economy when wages and prices have adjusted to their final equilibrium levels and workers don't have any relevant misperceptions. Graphically, it occurs at the intersection of the aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply curves. That's the end of that chapter. I definitely recommend you go back through, read the chapter in preparation for the quiz. We're going to tackle chapters 9 and 10 next.